Hello, I'm Rodger Citron. This is a Touro Law Review podcast. I'm a professor at Touro Law Center, and our guest today, we are delighted and really honored to have as our guest uh, Brenda Wineapple. She is the author of a number of books. She is also a professor, and we'll be talking today about her most recent book, Keeping the Faith. And with that introduction, we should start the discussion. Professor Wineapple or Brenda, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a treasure and it's a treat to be here. And we've known each other for a little while now. Been in touch. About myself, as you just said, I'm the author of a number of books. This is my seventh full book, not edited, and I consider myself a nonfiction writer. I guess it's true that my subjects are historical. Most recently, before Keeping the Faith, I wrote a book about the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. He was the first president ever to be impeached in the United States, happened in 1868, shortly after the Civil War, the first ever presidential assassination. And when I began that particular book, people thought, you're kind of crazy. Why are you interested in impeachment and the impeachment of Johnson? And I thought, well, because I should know more about it. It's shocking to me that I don't. And so that was that book. And now when people ask me how I got involved with writing about the Scopes trial, I'd written a little bit about it early 20th century, and I knew it was a very important trial. I should just say right up front, I never seen Inherit the Wind, but I know a lot of lawyers who have seen it, and a couple of people told me that they wouldn't have entered your storied profession without that particular movie. But that's what not did it. That didn't do it for me. But I had become very interested in trials, which I find very compelling. And in this case, as in the case of the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson, it becomes not just a watershed event, but it's a forum, and you all and lawyers and would-be lawyers know this better than I do. It's a forum where ideas get discussed and debated, and the ideas, the certain trials that become, I think, prominent, bring forward ideas about our country, ourselves, the kinds of issues and values that we hold dear from very different points of view. So I found that very compelling. And that's how I got to the Scopes trial.
Yes, and we'll talk about some of the drama of the Scopes trial. But first, perhaps for people younger than us who may never even heard of Inherit the Wind, can you sort of set the
True
scene?
enough.
Um,
True enough. But let me give you the background, all right? So that in 1925, the legislature in the state of Tennessee passed a law. It was familiarly known as the Butler Act. And simply put, what it did was prohibit the teaching of evolution in public schools, or any school actually that was paid for or supported by the state. So therefore, public schools. And it prohibited the teaching of the theory of evolution because it was said to conflict with the theory of creation as taught in the Bible. That was a kind of cause célèbre. Now, at the same time, not too long before that, this was 1925, 1920, the American Civil Liberties Union was just founded. And one of the things that they were doing was looking for test cases where they could give an airing to really important constitutional cases and cases where they felt civil liberties, citizens were being endangered. So they put an ad in a Tennessee paper. And people in the community of Dayton, Tennessee saw the ad. make a long story short. And they asked a young man named John Scopes, who also happened to be coach of the football team. People like that these days. And although he let his boys smoke, I don't know if they do that anymore. But in any event, so he volunteered to basically break the law, because he said, of course I taught evolution. It's in the state-sponsored textbook. It's the state-authorized textbook, and you can't teach biology without teaching evolution. So the ACLU was going to take the case. John Scopes said he would break the law. A very fundamentalist organization at the time asked William Jennings Bryan to prosecute the case because he would bring a lot of attention to it. William Jennings Bryan, just by the way, had been a 3-time presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket. He hadn't, I think, as we know, he was never elected, but he ran 3 times, and he was still a big force in the Democratic Party. So he was going to prosecute John Scopes. He said that this was going to be a duel to the death with Christianity, because he felt really what was at stake was Christianity itself. Once Clarence Darrow, very famous lawyer at the time, celebrated, known throughout the United States, once he heard that this trial was going to go forward with none other than William Jennings Bryan, Darrow volunteered to take the defense for no fee and work with the ACLU. So that's the background.
Yes, and I just want to add, one of the interesting things that you describe throughout, I was reminded of, forgive me, right, the O.J. Simpson case, in that there was a dream team on each side, effectively. That is, we think of it as Bryan and Scopes, but of course, there were very able and very interesting lawyers on both sides. And just curious, did you even know that, for example, at the beginning, or was that became part of the journey?
No, you know what I knew at the beginning. Again, I hadn't seen the movie. We studied this in passing with a lot of things, like the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in high school. It sort of went in and went out, like it does in most cases. So I hadn't known anything more about what you're calling the dream team on either side. And that was a revelation, and it was a wonderful revelation. Let me just say, for the defense of Scopes, and by the way, Scopes was guilty. I mean, from a very technical point of view, there's a law, he broke the law, end of story, but that's not the issue here. But back to the lawyers, there was Clarence Darrow, as I mentioned, who was famous. The other really, in a sense, famous man at the time was a man like Dudley Field Malone. He's not known today, but he was known in his own time. He had been an undersecretary in Woodrow Wilson's administration before that, and then he was collector of the Port of New York. He was an Irish Catholic divorcee, and he was a proud Catholic. And so here you have Clarence Darrow. I should have said he's an agnostic. He said he doesn't believe in God, but he doesn't disbelieve in God. He just doesn't know. There's Dudley Field Malone, who says, I'm Catholic and I'm proud of it. And then there was a man, Arthur Garfield Hayes, who came to be more well-known, very long storied life, and who was also, by the way, named for 3 presidents: Chester A. Arthur, John Garfield, James Garfield, and Rutherford Hayes. In any event, Hayes was working with the ACLU and was, for the rest of his life, a very important lawyer in civil liberties. He did quite a number of civil. And he was a secular Jew. So you have really on that side an interesting, I think, array of responses to, for want of a better word, religion, spirituality in the United States. On the other side, there was a man, Tom Stewart was his name, leading, besides Bryan, the defense, young man. And he went on to become briefly a senator from Tennessee. especially during the 40s, for a brief amount of time. And a very kind of rabid, seems to me, person that had very decided views. And I suppose he was well known in his time. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, there are Tennessee senators who are better known, I think, and have a different point of view.
Mhm. Um, and we have the array of attorneys, and let's start, I guess, on the prosecution side. That is, you described Bryan a bit, and I just to be clear, the duel to the death that you referred to, what was at stake for him in
Well,
the
it's interesting.
case?
Yeah,
And
no, let me back up about Bryan because, I should have meant he was a lawyer. I mean, he had been trained as a lawyer, but nobody really thought of him anymore as a lawyer. He had sort of almost literally jumped onto the national stage all the way back in 1896. He was a very young man, and he made his debut, if you will, at the Democratic National Convention, a kind of almost like a Barack Obama figure, not black, obviously, but in the sense that he seems to come from nowhere and galvanizes, just sets fire to the whole convention. And he was a progressive. That was the term they were used then. And the values were progressive values that he hated plutocrats, monopolists. He wanted to nationalize certain industries. He talked about sort of anticipating FDR, the forgotten man. So he was a very interesting figure. And as I said, became a real leader in the Democratic Party. And he ran 3 more times, never successfully. But as he aged and perhaps got more frustrated, who knows? I can't psychologize him exactly. But he really understood Darwinism or evolution to be social Darwinism. And in a sense, his hatred of what he considered evolution, a theory of evolution, came from his understanding that it shouldn't be a dog eat dog world, which is how he understood, social Darwinism, that only the fittest survive. And he hated that, understandably, but that wasn't, of course, Darwinism at all. He actually, because he was so powerful, Woodrow Wilson put him in the cabinet. He was a Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. So again, he was no slouch. He was no unknown. He was a big advocate on the one hand of prohibition, but on the other hand of women getting the vote. So people are complicated. But he had become, in many ways, more and more intolerant of other religions and points of view than his. He had become not a fundamentalist, and by that, in those terms, I meant that he read the Bible literally. And in one version of the Bible, because there are many versions. So he had become something of, and was accused by Darrow of being something of a fanatic. And so, I mean, he was an unusual man in many ways, and a very gifted orator. But by the time of the trial, you could say that he was reciting some of the same old platitudes, that he had become disengaged in some ways from the values that made him so likable in many ways.
and one of the pleasures really of doing the podcast, especially with someone who's a historian and a biographer, really is that I just want to stay a little bit more with Bryan, because to me he was a little bit less known beyond sort of AP history from high school. But he is fascinating, and he's fascinatingly complicated. And then there were sort of two things, as I was sort of reviewing for today. One is that is, and this is true for Darrow, but just staying with Bryan, right? There's sort of an aging piece to this. which is manifested physically. That is, Bryan, I mean, there's this, I think you have this wonderful account of the speech in 1896 that vaults him to prominence. And he may be at least, as eloquent in the words that he speaks, maybe not, but as a result of his age, that's however many years later we're talking about, I guess,
Well,
nearly
it's almost
30.
30 years
Yeah,
later.
30 years later. And so that aspect of him, that is, as an orator, I thought was interesting since we sort of, the AP history view is 1896, right? That's what we know, William Jennings Bryan. And then the other thing, if I may, and then I'll yield, is just was he diabetic? That
Yes.
is, and so there's this description of what he's eating during the trial, which is he seems oblivious, or unrestrained with respect to his diet. And I just thought that was a marvelous, humanizing detail. I'll stop now, just so you can say a
Let
bit
me just
more.
say something about that because there's two ways to understand that. And the first way is the sort of way you're talking about, the comic way. Bryan, there was a banquet in Dayton, Tennessee, which is where the trial took place. And John Scopes was there and Bryan, many others. And there were a lot of potatoes. I think maybe there were mashed potatoes. I don't remember. And Bryan asked Scopes if he was going to finish his potatoes, and Scopes said, "No, you can have them." And then Scopes later said, "I knew he knew nothing about science if he's eating all those potatoes and he's diabetic." So it's to be fair, because I always try to be fair. I As I came to understand it, I think this is correct, and I don't really know, but that the kind of diabetes he had made him feel always very hungry. So there's that. But on the other hand, he should have known better. He wasn't supposed to be eating all those potatoes. But he was getting thinner and thinner. These days you have to see things. You can't help seeing things through the present, of course. And you bring up the question of age, and we had presidential contenders, or we had two who were visibly aging, and now we have one who's visibly aging. So that becomes an issue, certainly. But I'm not sure that that's what happened with Bryan, that the issue was that he was aging, except insofar as he had become more and more angry and more desperate. Clarence Darrow was actually voted for Bryan, worked for Bryan in the 1896 campaign because their politics were very similar. But Darrow was at the convention I mentioned, and he was seated with a man named John Altgeld, who was a governor of Illinois, also very progressive, died very young. Nobody knows who he is. But anyway, they were very good friends. And when they left, one said to the other, "That was the best speech I ever heard," was how people understood it. And the other one said, "Yes, but what did he say?" So in some sense, there is that idea of inflated rhetoric when Bryan was young and when he was older. It just hadn't changed. It had just become meaner in a way, less. He was less able to listen to points of view, and he had narrowed. I don't know if that's age or what it is, but he may have always been narrow in those ways. There just wasn't the occasion for it to come out.
Um, yeah, and my guess is when we get into the trial, we may come back to this, but if we can cross over to the defense now, and um, your book does have several photographs of both Bryan and Darrow, but with Darrow, and of course, having seen the movie, was it Spencer
That's
Tracy?
crazy. Yeah.
Yes.
I did see
So,
the movie after I finished the book because
so
I
it's
knew people would ask me about it.
um, but Darrow, just sort of develop that idea of who was he and what did the case mean for him. And perhaps while you're doing that, I just want to sort of, bait the hook with, can you say a little bit about how he dressed or how he was attired when he went to court. And I'll leave it there.
No, I can start there with his attire. And his attire was, I think, part of his courtroom strategy, but it was real. In other words, it was a strategy, but it was also who he was and who he was. A very tall man, broad-shouldered, but there was a way in which he didn't use his height to intimidate people, rather that there was a rumpled quality about him. Even as he aged, speaking of age, his face got more rumpled, more lined. His shirts looked like and his suits looked like he slept in them. As he wore suspenders, he would hook his fingers in his suspenders. He developed and had a folksy style. I mean, he was from the Midwest, and he had a wonderful ability to talk directly to people, whether it was people at a lecture, whether it was a jury. People thought of him as kind. He was brilliant, make no mistake, but he was not of the kind of brilliance that is effete or abstract or intimidating. In fact, his whole persona and his demeanor, his hair would be falling over his eyes, as I said, he would be hooking his fingers in his suspenders, his shirts were wrinkled or torn. He was comfortable in his own skin, though. He wasn't dressing for success in that way. So that he seemed accessible, he seemed available. And I think the journalist Lincoln Steffens once called him, he was the attorney for the damned. In other words, he had some very wealthy clients, but if you were in trouble and he felt you were being abused, victimized unfairly, he would take the case. He took a lot of cases for no fee at all. He used the high fees that he would get to pay for the people who couldn't pay, really, in that sense. And he was some would say he's on the side of the angels, others would say he was a kind of crass opportunist, because he would try some of the cases almost in the papers. That was true of the Scopes trial. He wanted the news journalists there, and there were over 200 that came to this tiny little town. So he knew what he was doing, but for him, the stakes were really very important. It was the separation of church and state, pure and simple, as a constitutional issue for him. We love and inhabit a secular country where one is free to worship or not worship. That's a kind of basic freedom that he feels is constitutionally protected. He wanted people to be protected. He felt that the law serves those who can pay, so he would always come to those aid of, as I said, of those who couldn't pay. He was known early in his career as a labor lawyer. He would defend bomb throwers and anarchists, and he felt that this trial, the Scopes trial, was about intolerance, basically. And he was a man who had long fought against, I should say, intolerance. He was one of the early founders, members of the NAACP, long before, I mean, he kind of made people uncomfortable. He said interracial marriage is fine. He called out anyone who persecuted anyone else because of their difference, different religion, different skin color, what have you. And so that gives you a kind of thumbnail portrait of Darrow. Also, I should mention, just before, a year before the Scopes trial, another big trial. You think O.J. Simpson was big. Well, in 1924, the big trial was Leopold and Loeb. I think there are movies about that too. These were two young, rich kids, teenagers in Chicago, who killed a third. Why? They felt like it. No reason, because they thought they could get away with it. They were clearly guilty. They said they did it. They did it for the thrill of it. Darrow took the case. Why did he take the case? There's no case. He took the case not because he thought they were innocent, but because he didn't want to see them executed. He didn't believe in capital punishment. He didn't believe that the government had the right to take anybody's life. Put them in jail for the rest of their lives. He's fine with that. They were guilty. They were disturbed, but not capital punishment. And remarkably, they were not executed. He won.
Yes.
That's really something.
Um,
Right?
this is just a digression because, of course, there is a film. I really can't remember the name of it, but I did watch it in the last year, totally unrelated to reading your book. And as they're sort of building to the climax, and it more or less tracks the history of the case, I said,
Leopold and Loeb, you mean? Which
pardon?
case? Which case are you talking? Leopold and
Oh,
Loeb.
Leopold and Loeb, and
Yeah, yeah.
I really can't remember the name of the movie, but I was like,
Compulsion? Is it compulsion?
it could be. I feel like it was in the 50s.
Yeah,
It's
so I haven't seen it. That's a bridge too far for me. I don't want to see about two kids killing another kid. But anyway.
But I was like, well, there's no way they're not getting the death penalty. And whether that's because that's a 21st century sort of, well, if this is what happened, there's no way they're not getting executed. But of course, it tracks what happened, which is they do not. That is, they get, I guess it was life imprisonment. And um, all by way of saying, I agree, extraordinary outcome in that case, in Leopold and Loeb.
Well, it tells you what kind of lawyer he must have been, really, because talk about being tried in the newspapers. I mean, it was a horrible crime and there was no reason for it at all. And there's no justification. And they didn't offer any. There's no extenuating circumstances. There's nothing. And of course, everyone wanted them executed. I mean, you can almost understand, but he thought that was bloodlust. I mean, so for him to turn that jury around, and right after the Scopes trial, he defended a Black family in Detroit that defended themselves against a group of white supremacists who came to get them out of the neighborhood, came and armed. And the Black family was armed, and they shot one of the people who had come to, I guess, get rid of them or kill them, who knows. And that case too, he made this great plea to the jury saying, because the jury was obviously all white, and said, put yourselves in the position of this family, these people. They knew what the history of Black people are in this country. This is in 1925, right? And he won.
Yeah.
He's quite a guy, really. Let's not forget, though, he himself was on trial twice because he was accused of bribing a juror. So, like I said, people are complicated.
I was corresponding, and then we really will come back to it, but with my criminal law professor who, in fact, practiced, out of his office. Essentially, he had a criminal defense practice for decades, and he absolutely, same way, I think, really idolized Darrow, has read the biographies and so on, did not overlook what you just pointed about the jury tampering. And he said, this is when we were corresponding, well, nobody's perfect. Which is another way of saying people are complicated. So there's sort of two things to talk about, I think, at least as it relates to the trial. And in the trial, it's protracted, and yet not much happens, at least until the defense puts William Jennings Bryan on the stand, and Darrow cross-examines Bryan. So perhaps we'll start with that, because that, of course, that is the drama of Inherit the Wind. I think that, to the extent that we have a popular understanding or any sort of, memory or understanding of what it was, it was the confrontation between the two.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? And especially, I was rereading on the train ride home today, specifically your account of that chapter, and you seem to have drawn on a number of sources in reconstructing or constructing the confrontation in court. So can you tell us what happened and then how you wrote about it?
Yeah, two things. What happened was um, really shocking, I think, from the point of view of the legal profession, which was that, as you said, Clarence Darrow called Bryan to the stand as a witness. His suggestion was, or his argument was, well, he says he's an expert on the Bible. Let's talk to him about the Bible. And of course, the other members of the prosecution team that I mentioned, Tom Stewart and the others, they didn't want Bryan to go on the stand. But Bryan insisted because he thought this was a great forum for him to get his ideas across. And he had quite a number of ideas, which were later published, actually. So there was a kind of shock, I think, to everyone, obviously. Now, the second thing to notice is that this trial took place in July in Tennessee, in Dayton, Tennessee, as I mentioned. And it's really hot in July in Tennessee, as you can imagine. And it was particularly hot during the days of this trial. And there was no air conditioning. And in fact, the jury foreman had to ask to get a fan. I mean, it was just really awful to be there. Just imagine how much sweat there was, because the courtroom was jam-packed with spectators and journalists, and the journalists had brought in all their equipment. They wanted to make newsreels and microphones because the trial had been broadcast. Radio was new, it was broadcast in Chicago live. So the judge was afraid that the floor was going to give way in the courtroom. It was starting to kind of wobble. So he insisted everybody go outside. There were long benches set up. So right there, when you think about it, you've got Bryan, three-time presidential candidate, orator, said to be, have silver tongue, eloquent, on the stand, such as it was, sort of set up this stand. And Clarence Darrow, famous lawyer, defender of Leopold Loeb, defender of labor, defender, and they're all outside. So that's incredible right to begin with. And it proceeded from there in the hot sun. The sleeves are all rolled up and everybody's sitting around and boys are selling ice cream. It's crazy when you think about it. Now you say, how did I write about exactly what happened? In a way, it was very easy. It was not the hard part of writing this book, because there are transcripts of the trial. That transcript of the trial is published. I mean, in some sense, that's what the playwrights who originally wrote Inherit the Wind became the movie. That's what they used too. I mean, they cut and pasted and used everything and so forth. But you have a transcript of a trial. I have dealt with court transcripts before in other books that I have written. And, I find them absolutely riveting, because there's no drama like a courtroom situation where you have an attorney questioning and re-questioning and turning around, and then somebody questioning the witness again. It's very complicated, very interesting. It's inherently dramatic. I mean, you can think of, why are there so many, Law and Order franchises, same kind of thing. So in that sense, I had the transcript, and also I had, many newspaper accounts of what happened. And newspapers are partisan, of course. They were then, they are now. But you can read enough of them and find out what's happening. So in some ways, it was fun to write, actually, because it was so shocking in many ways what happened. The repartee, it's all dialogue. That's the other thing about a trial in the courtroom. It's back and forth. It's dialogue. It's theater. It's really theater. So that part, that's how I came to do it. And the book was challenging in many ways, but that not that entirely. Although I have to say that if you imagine, as I try to do when I'm writing something, that it must have been very painful to watch, because both men were getting more and more agitated and angry, and Bryan was humiliated. It's not fun to watch that. I can't imagine that, but nonetheless, it was something that I think Darrow felt it was important to do.
Yeah, a minor follow-up and then a related question. Um, because in rereading that chapter, it begins as something from the transcript, that is, with the exchange, with the dialogue. But of course, there are, as they become um, agitated or aggravated, you put in to indicate that that's going on, things like people raising their voice, that is the witness or the lawyer raising their voice. And so that's one of the reasons why I asked the question. I take it, but I should just ask the question, that was from the newspaper accounts. But let me just ask, because you fill it out in a way so that it's very clear
What's happening?
the escalation.
Yeah, there are a lot of accounts. Not just there were newspaper accounts. There was a raw transcript, as I said. But there were also numbers of people in their letters wrote about it too. So there's a variety of sources that I could draw on to sort of reproduce the emotional power of the scene, as well as just the sort of back and forth dialogue, so that I could begin to actually see it, feel it, experience it. Because, as I said, there were a number of firsthand sources, and not one. There's never one that's authoritative, but you can begin to get as I said, you can read the emotional temperature through all of that. So there's a lot of material. There really is a lot of material, because it was, I don't know if we've said this, but the trial was covered internationally. It was a big deal. I mean, people may not know about it now, but in 1925, it was shocking, and it was front page news. As far away as China, they were carrying it. I mean, just, to a certain extent, partly it was many places just couldn't believe it. What's going on in America? Seems to be a perennial question.
We'll come to that. The And then I just wanted to use, because you said, oh, this wasn't the hardest part of writing the book.
Yeah.
What was?
Well, you've read the book, and I hope others do too. Excuse me, but for me, it was the whole point of writing the book wasn't just the trial, which would have been very short. Why this trial? What did it mean? When did it happen? What did it signify? As I said, in a courtroom, there are values being exchanged, points of view. And so the sort of social and cultural and political matrix and was important to me. And then as a writer, keeping the suspense going so that I could cover, what was going on, the rise of, the kind of influx of immigrants who'd coming into the cities, especially, but also into the countryside since the turn of the century. The rise of the labor unions and labor unrest that going on, that is Bryan spoke about, and Darrow too, the sense of, the common person, the forgotten person, people have been forgotten, and they had been in the clutches of big business, certainly. So that was all important. Then you have, before the trial, but before, well, I want to say before this terrible World War I, but before and then after, you have not just the immigrants, but a lot of them are being deported. You have the Red Scare, what was called the Red Scare, because there were so many people so fearful of now Russia, which had become communist. And so So between that and anarchism and socialism, people were just feeling that the world had fallen apart. Not to mention from 1914 to 1918 in Europe and then here in the United States. It's a terrible war. Nobody had seen a war like World War One. Nobody could really, I still can't figure out why it was fought. It was just awful. It was the introduction of things like, aerial bombing and poison gas. I mean, some of this put Bryan over the edge because he blamed science and technology for this. And then at the same time as you have all of this in the background too, is the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Remember the Ku Klux Klan back in the 19th century? Well, they're back, and they're back since 1915, and they're getting more and more powerful. This same summer as the Scopes trial, there's a huge rally and march in Washington, D.C., 200,000 strong of Klans people, all dressed up in hoods and, pillowcases. It's scary, really, at the same time. And then so many people felt, as I said, not just forgotten, but embattled and afraid. What's going on? It's the so-called jazz age. It's the roaring 20s. Kids are teenagers are either killing each other or necking in the back of cars. There are cars. There were never cars before. So this is the kind of context for the Scopes trial. So the difficulty for me in writing the book was to create that context without losing sight of where we're going and why we're going, and how all of these various elements funnel into that trial, as I said, and keeping that narrative powerful. That's, it was a challenge. But what isn't, right?
Well, this is something that I think we've, discussed a bit twice, and I think now we can sort of make this center stage, which is the trial and these different purposes or functions. That is all the things that may be going on in a trial. There's a legal dimension, there's a political dimension, or there may be, and there certainly was here, a political dimension. And of course, there's even a broader,
Yeah.
if you want to say societal,
Sure.
and that idea of, that in the widest lens possible, in some ways, the trial is, because it's a case and there's conflict, right? It's in some sense, there's, in the broadest sense, a conflict between values, across the society or for the society. And so what do you think, was going on in the trial? You know, Ultimately, I think all of these things were going on, but if you had to sort of say this is really what the trial was about,
Mhm.
how would you answer that question? Or could you answer
Well,
the question?
it, I would be, it would be wrong, and it would be sort of against what I've tried to do to be reductive about it, certainly. Um, but but in the broader sense, you could say that the trial is about intolerance. The trial is about people being allowed and able to think for themselves. The trial is about education and learning and the ability to have materials available to people. The trial is about thinking and rationality in that sense. So, these are abstractions. I don't like to say in that way, but say things in that way. But Darrow made some wonderful comments about the way in which, if this law is allowed, the Butler Act, to persist, it kind of lights the way, he said it much better than I will, to intolerance, bigotry, fanaticism. And he saw this as, to put it in cliche terms, a kind of a slippery slope where, you let this go and suddenly you are mandating how people behave, who now in these terms, today, who they love, how they comport themselves, all of those freedoms. That's why the ACLU was involved too in that particular sense, because they really did think that these were constitutional issues and wanted to get it before the Supreme Court. So it was really important, and that's why Darrow and the ACLU, different points of view, but nonetheless converging on that, got involved, and why it seemed so important not to let something that is really about, as I said, intolerance, bigotry, prejudice, and censorship, censoring even how you think, not to let it pass. You can't really let those kinds of things pass. So I think that's really important. It's also from a different point of view, just one more thing, and that's why I said, like, you can't be reductive. People are afraid of change, and in the simplest sense, evolution is about change over time, and accepting that. And it was a time of when people really felt, as I said, something had broken apart. Something had happened, and they wanted to stop it from happening. But Bryan, I mean, he was his version of the Bible. Once you start saying only my version of X or Y is the right version, that's the way of what a kind of, the nicest way to put it is he wanted a Christian theocratic nation. A not so nice way of put it is to say it's a kind of totalitarian way of thinking.
That really does bring us, I think, to perhaps our last topic, and that is, the relevance of the book for today. And you note that in at least one place in the book that I can specifically remember. On the other hand, you didn't, I think, push too hard on this point. And so again, it's sort of like the two-part question of, how do you see what you wrote as being relevant to today? And then also, how did you think about it? In other words, how did you decide how much to say or not say on that specific point?
The book is about the Scopes trial in 1925. You, my reader, are free to make the parallels. The parallels are there. I don't need to become didactic. I don't need to, tell you how to think about them. What I want to do is tell a story that is textured enough and chilling enough for you to draw the conclusions and the relevant conclusions. Because from my point of view, this is history, and my job is to make it come alive. If it comes alive, you'll see connections. We've touched on them here without my saying them. So I, as you say, mention things, but I'm going to do this with a light hand and kind of open the door or make it ajar and point you in a little direction. But then it's up to you, really, in some ways. I think we forget at our peril, because once we forget what happened and what the really disquieting strands of American life and culture are, if we forget them, then we can't be vigilant about them. And so I want to show that on the one hand, there are these really difficult, dark strands that have been with us for a very long time, and yet there have been, and one can hope, ways to combat them and to push back. So that was my decision.
Uh-huh. I think we'll stop there. But I just want to say, and you alluded to this, and I of course should have mentioned it from the start. I took a course from you during the pandemic at CUNY. It was a delight, and it's been a delight to be able to speak with you. A real pleasure and a real privilege to be able to speak with you today about your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to see you and talk with you again. Unfortunately, we're still doing it on screens, but that's the legacy of the pandemic. But at the same time, it's wonderful to be able to do something like this, and I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.